Hello, welcome once again to Leto's Law. I'm Steve Leto. I've mentioned before I've written a few books about cars, including some of the cars behind me. And one of my favorite stories of all time that I ran across doing research on these books is that in the 1960s and 70s, Chrysler pulled a fast one on NASCAR. And I'm not talking about on the track. They actually pulled a little scam. They pulled a little prank, I guess, on NASCAR, which NASCAR didn't find out for quite some time. And now it's kind of one of those things you look back on it and go kind of like, it is funny, but you wonder what NASCAR thinks of it. But I'll explain. You have to understand what NASCAR is all about. When it started, NASCAR actually was a place where you could bring a car in off the street, pass a safety inspection, and race it. And the guy who won the first NASCAR race, or who was declared the first winner of the first NASCAR race, actually drove the winning car to the track and then drove it home after the race. I mean, that's how stock these cars were. But it happened pretty quickly that the cars became unstock as they would modify the innards and the engines and the drivetrains and so on. And so it got to the point in the 60s where you had these cars that had the shape of stock cars, but they actually had completely different insides. And around the mid 60s, Chrysler and Ford got into an arms race where they were actually trying to build faster cars in an attempt to win in the races they thought would help sell cars. There's a saying, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Whether that's true or not, no one knows, but they thought that was true. General Motors actually stepped back and said, guys, knock yourselves out. We're not even involved in this. But the funny thing is that NASCAR had actually told the companies, you can't support the cars and the racers directly. So it was all kind of like on the down low. And so Chrysler was helping race teams that drove Chryslers, including the Richard Petty and Bobby Isaac and Charlie Glotzback and Buddy Baker. You've heard these names, I hope. And then, of course, Ford was helping their guys, like David Pearson, for example, is the most famous Ford driver from that era. And so, as these races were heating up, Chrysler introduced the Hemi, the 426 Hemi, and their cars were really, really fast, but the problem is that their cars were not aerodynamic. And both Ford and Chrysler realized this right around the same time, that you get to a point of diminishing returns by increasing the horsepower. Sooner or later, you got to do something about the shape of the car to get through the air. We're not racing in a vacuum here, people. So Ford actually had some decently shaped cars in the later end of the 60s. And Chrysler, of course, had the Roadrunner, which is like a box on wheels. And they had the Dodge Charger, which wasn't much better because it had a flat front end. And so they started doing some aerodynamic work on these cars. And they came to the conclusion eventually that they needed to actually put a nose cone and a wing on the car, like this, if they really wanted that car to go fast. And the funny thing was, at that time, to qualify as a stock car, a company only had to build 500 of them and sell them to the public. So Chrysler did all the work on these cars in a wind tunnel and realized they could make the car actually faster than anything else out there by doing that. And so they said, hey, let's build 500 Charger Daytonas and sell them to the public. And it'd be a huge loss financially. But then we can race the cars, and then, of course, we'll dominate the big tracks. So that was the plan, okay? So they do a ton of work out at the Chelsea Proving Grounds, mocking up these cars. And they have two test cars that they're mocking up and playing with. One's nicknamed DC-93, one's nicknamed DC-74. And DC stood for Dodge Charger. And at the time, and I'm not going to get too deeply into this, but at the time, if you wanted to race in NASCAR and have a competitive car, you didn't go to a dealership and buy a car and then strip it and do it. There was a company called Nichols Engineering in Indiana that actually had a relationship with Chrysler, where Chrysler would ship the cars to them bodies in white, which means the cars weren't complete because they don't need the interior, for instance. And then Nichols Engineering would make the cars robust for racing by putting a roll cage in it and doing stuff with the interior, and also reinforcing the engine compartment. These cars are unibodies, so they don't have a frame. And so they did a bunch of that work, and then they would sell these cars to different race teams. So, like, for instance, Bobby Isaac's K&K Daytona was at one point in time sold to his team by Nichols Engineering. And so Nichols Engineering had done the work, and when they got the bodies in white or whatever it was they worked off of, they had to put a tag on the car because under Indiana law, they had to actually put a VIN tag on the car, even though these cars didn't bear typical VINs. So they put their own manufacturer number on it. They just called DC-93, that car, and DC-74. And those cars were both owned by Chrysler. They were Chrysler engineering cars. The cars were then sent to Chelsea Proving Grounds, which is a gigantic oval where they did all kinds of top secret testing. And it was out there that they experimented with the different shapes of the nose and the different shapes of the wing and the height of the wing and all that stuff. And I've talked about that before, and I've written articles about it, and I've written books. Like I said, I wrote a book called Dodge Daytona Plymouth Superbird that talks all about this development, hundreds of photographs, some of which I'll be showing you in a moment. And they start building these cars out at the Chelsea Proving Grounds. And they have DC-73, which is the low-speed car, and DC-74, which is the low-speed car, and DC-93, which is the high-speed car. And you might go, wait, they have a low-speed race? Yeah, they do. So there's science behind this. Because you can do some work at lower speeds and other work at higher speeds. And sometimes they take a car and put it in a wind tunnel where it doesn't matter how fast the car can go. It just has to sit there and have the wind blowing over it. That kind of thing. And so anyways, after they got the high-speed car, DC-93, set up as well as they could, NASCAR had a season going at that time. And so they actually Chrysler decided, let's sneak this car into a race and see how it does in an actual race. And the companies weren't supposed to own cars at the time. So they actually cut a deal with Nichols Engineering and said, look, we're going to give you back DC-93. Paint it like it's your car, and we'll get Charlie Glotz back, who's a well-known race car driver. I've met the guy, very, very nice guy. We'll have Charlie Glotz back, drive it, qualify it, and drive it, and we'll just say it's a Nichols Engineering car and see what happens. And so Charlie Glotzback qualified the car at 199 miles an hour. And there was no question that they were going to break 200 very, very quickly with this car. But here's what happened, unfortunately, is there was a Professional Drivers Association that didn't think the track at Talladega, which was the fall race in 1969, they didn't think the track was safe. They actually thought the track was unsafe. It had just been built. It had some ripples and stuff in the corners, and some drivers were complaining about the problems medically that they're physically having going around this track. And Bill France said, guys, you guys just aren't used to these high banks and the speed you're doing. The G's you guys are pulling at 198 miles an hour on those gigantic banks, you're just not used to it. And they're like, dude, this track will kill somebody. So unfortunately, the Professional Drivers Association decided to boycott the race. And when they pulled out, Charlie Glotzback pulled out, Richard Petty pulled out. All of the big names you've heard pulled out. And then a few of them stayed in, like Bobby Isaac stayed in, because he'd not been invited to join the union. And a guy named Richard Brickhouse also raced because he would never have gotten a ride otherwise. And somebody big said, hey, do you want to drive our car? We got it qualified by somebody else, but you can drive it. So Richard Brickhouse ran, and so did Bobby Isaac. Those are the two wing cars in the field. And Richard Brickhouse won the race. And I believe it's his only race that he won in NASCAR. And it was a very unusual situation. But the problem is that DC-93 sat the race out. It did not race because Charlie Glotzback didn't race, and Chrysler Engineering didn't want to put the car into the hands of somebody who was not a very good driver because they'd spent so much time and money developing that car. So here's the thing. The race ends, they continue with the season, and eventually they do get to race these cars on tracks in 69, 1970, and they develop the way these cars are going to run, and they realize this. But all along, Chrysler would take DC-93 to different courses, different tracks, before everyone else showed up, and they would drive it on the track with a professional driver. They get permission from NASCAR to do this. And then they would calculate all the data, the wing settings, and everything, and they pass that information along to all the other race teams. So it's one of those things where NASCAR knew what was going on, but as long as it wasn't well publicized, they kind of didn't care. And so right around this time, somebody at Chrysler said, you know, that car, DC-93, could do 200 miles an hour, no question. It could. But they hadn't been entering it in races. They'd just simply been using it for testing. So somebody said, hey, wait a second. This would be a good publicity stunt for us to pull. Let's take DC-93 to a track and run it and get NASCAR to time it and make it official. So they contacted Bill France at NASCAR and said, hey, can we borrow the Talladega Raceway for a day and do some high-speed testing because we want to see if we can get our car to break 200 miles per hour. And Bill France said, you know, sure, knock yourself out. We'll provide you a timer. And they told Bill France, they go, well, we're going to issue a press release to say that we were doing transmission testing because that's something you can't see on a car, right? And Bill France said, well, by the way, while you're out there, can you do some more testing for me? And they said, what's that? And he goes, I want to know what effect it will have on the cars if we remove the side window glass. Because NASCAR used to run with the side windows up, and that's a better aerodynamic shape for the car. And he was thinking about having the cars remove the side windows like they have them today. Number one, to slow the cars down, but also to make the crashes less messy. If you put a car into a crash and it's got all the side window glass in it, that stuff ends up on the track. So he goes, I'd like to remove the window glass, and I want to know if that'll work to slow the cars down. So the first thing they did is they went out and they ran the car with the windows up, and they got it to break 200 miles per hour. And this would have been on, I got the date here, March 24th, 1970. And the official speed was 200 point, I think 447. And that was the run that Buddy Baker did. And what's funny, I've interviewed people who were there and read accounts of it. It's kind of funny because they actually took the car out. They were getting close, a whole bunch of times. And they finally dialed it in just perfectly. And it's literally a team of engineers from Chrysler doing all of this work, just trying to tweak one last mile per hour out of this car. And they got it. They broke 200 average speed on a closed course in this car on this track. And NASCAR sanctioned it, so that is an official NASCAR legal vehicle on a NASCAR track. Therefore, that is the new NASCAR official speed record. Now, it's not a speed in a race, and it's not a qualifying speed at a pole, but that was, again, like I said, under those conditions, that was a legal thing. So, DC 93 and DC 74 eventually get sent back to Chrysler. And in 1971, the wings wound up being outlawed anyway, so they're all put out to pasture. Bobby Isaac and his guys, K&K Racing and Nord Krauskopf, the owner, and Harry Hyde, their crew chief, took their car to Bonneville in 1971 and set a whole host of speed records with that car. Fascinating story behind that, but we're not talking about that car. We're talking about DC 93, the high-speed Chrysler engineering car. And in 1970, when it looked like the wing cars were going to go out to pasture, Bill France contacted Chrysler and said, guys, can I have that car for my museum? I'm going to start a museum, a NASCAR Hall of Fame museum, and I want to put that car in as the first NASCAR automobile to break 200 miles per hour on a NASCAR track. And Chrysler said, sure. And they shipped him a car. And there's a bunch of famous photos of them presenting this car to Bill France in the infield of a racetrack someplace. And then Bill France put the car in his museum. And I've walked around the car, and I've seen the car. I've got photographs of the car, which I will put here, I'm sure. And the funny thing, of course, is that that's not the correct car. It is not DC 93. What they shipped him was DC 74. And the reason is that DC 93 was gone. Chrysler didn't own it anymore. And what had happened, and this is a fascinating story that a guy named Greg Kwiatkowski figured out. And some of the photographs I'm using here are Greg's. And they're in my book. And Greg Kwiatkowski works at Chrysler. And he looked at the car in the museum and he goes, this isn't the right car. This car doesn't look right. He did some research, he dug up some papers, and he found some papers and he found some internal documents at Chrysler that said, hey, Bill France just asked us if he could have DC 93, but we don't have it anymore. Can we just give him DC 74 and paint it blue? And he won't know the difference. And somebody said, yeah. In fact, it looks to us like we've got the car. It's going to take a couple gallons of blue paint, but beyond that, sure, ship it off to him. So they took the low-speed test car, painted it blue, shipped it to him, and press conferences and everything in front of the wrong car. And in the museum, the wrong car. So now here's the interesting thing. The fast one that Chrysler pulled on NASCAR was to give them the wrong car. And so for years, you'd go to the museum and there's this car there, and it looks like the right car. It's blue, it's got the numbers on the side, and it's obviously a car from the era built by Nichols Engineering. Everything about it is correct, except it's just not the right car. So Greg is deep down, he's a researcher. That's not his full-time job, but he's good at it. And he starts digging, he starts asking around, he's looking, finding everybody he can find, and finally he gets somebody who says, I know what happened to DC 93. He says, what's that? They go, there was a guy named Don White who was a race car driver who did a lot of racing in USAC. And he did a lot of also tooling for us, or manufacturing of small machine parts for us. And he's down in Indiana, I think, or Illinois, someplace down in the Midwest. And somewhere along the line, he asked us, what are you guys going to do with that car now that it's parked? And they go, oh, I don't know, why? And he goes, well, you guys owe me some money. And rather than me invoicing you for the money, why don't we just swap it? You give me that car and we'll call it a day. And they said, okay, let's ask run. They asked run, sure, let's do it. So they did that. So it was a simple bookkeeping thing, and Don White now has DC 93 down in where he is. I think in, like I said, I think Illinois or Iowa maybe. And I apologize. It's been a while since I've looked at this up close, and I was just double checking the other facts. And Don White is, at least then, he's still around. He's still around. So Greg calls him, tracks him down, and finds him. And Don White answers the phone, and Greg goes, yeah, I'm doing some research here. I'm trying to find out where DC 93 is, the old Chrysler engineering car. And Don White goes, well, yeah, I had it, and I raced it for a few years. And he said that Nate USAC allowed them to race the winged cars through 71 or 72. And then he rebodied the car and pulled the wing and the nose cone off of it and rebodied it as a 72 or 73, but a later Charger. Raced it in USAC, including on like dirt tracks. And then he said, after I raced it for a few years, parked it. Greg goes, do you know where the car is? He goes, yeah, I'm looking at it. This is the greatest phone call of all time. You've been searching for years to find something, and you go, do you know where something is? And the guy goes, yes, I am looking at it. And Greg goes, what do you mean? And Don goes, it's parked next to my building. It's right there. It's been sitting there for the last 20 years, 30 years. I will fast forward here to let you know that Greg bought the car off Don White. Don knew what it was, and Greg bought it from him. But of course, the car had been rebodied as a later Charger, and I don't believe it had an engine or transmission in it because Don had used those in later cars. But Don goes, if what's left of it is of value to you, yeah, I'll sell it to you. And trust me, Greg's the right guy to have it because he's in the process of restoring it right now back to the way it was during the speed run that DC 93 did, where it set the first time a NASCAR vehicle set correctly did a 200-mile-an-hour plus lap on a NASCAR track. So Greg's got the car now, doing the work, and great guy. I've talked to him many times. Helped me with a lot of questions I had about this story and others for my book, Dodge Daytona and Plymouth Superbird. And of course, the cool thing is that he's got the car. He's going to restore the car, and when the car's done, he'll do something appropriate with the car to make sure that people can see it and so on. But it gets us back to the story about how Chrysler was contacted by Bill France, and they said, we'd like to have your high-speed Chrysler engineering car for our museum. Can we have it? And they said, sure, and sent them the wrong car. They knew it. They knew it because they had to paint it a different color to make it look right. And it's one of those funny stories. And I have not seen the car in a few years, so I don't know if they still have it on display or if they still have it on display with that marking, because it's an important car. It's one of the two cars used to develop the wing cars. It just wasn't the 200-mile-per-hour car. So I've always loved that story. But I know a lot of stuff about these cars, and if other interesting stories pop into my mind, I'll talk about them. But like I said, that's one of my favorites because it was kind of like a scam, I guess you'd call it, a prank, a caper, pulled off in plain view. And eventually, if you guys came forward and said, yeah, let's explain what happened here. So that's what happened. Questions or comments, put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.